This afternoon we've got two really good presentations by two really excellent friends of mine who will be talking about San Antonio's place in regards to race, slavery, economics, class, and gender. And I think that one of the interesting things about the city that we live in is how peculiar our city is in regards to race relations compared to other locations. And so without further ado, I'm going to announce the two panelists, Marcel Salas, civil rights leader for a number of years in this city, and I don't think I really need to introduce Mr. Salas, but a professor, a teacher, a leader, a politician, and just a good overall man. And then Francis Galan, professor of history at Texas A&M, San Antonio as well, assistant professor, and taught previously at UTSA and Our Lady of Lake University. We're going to have about 20 to 25 minutes per presentation, and then that should allow us about 10 minutes for a question and answer session afterwards. So without further ado, Mr. Salas, please come forth.
Thank you very much, and we'll hope this thing gets to working real good. And I'll start without any further ado. Unknown to many people, the city of San Antonio had very much part of Mexico, obviously, in the very beginnings, and part of the Spanish world for a very long period of time. And when we look at history, when we look at the panorama of history and its political consequences and ramifications, we are stuck with a bunch of different things. I have an acronym I like to use called HOLD, and with an E at the end, and that means hold everything. The H stands for half-truths, the O is for omissions, the L for lies, D for distortions, and E at the end means erasure. And that's been very common tactic used over the course of many years, centuries, for very good reasons, that we'll talk about. Blacks included in the 300-year Tricentennial. I have to add, I am a commissioner on the San Antonio 300 Years Tricentennial Commission. I'm also a member of the Bexar County Historical Commission, and so I've been doing some of this stuff for a little while, even before that. But as I was asked to do some of this stuff, some of it I relied upon a past thesis I did, some of it on a lot of reading, and then trying to document it with primary source documentation. San Antonio's black community has really shaped this city in many ways, although you wouldn't know it if we just read what's generally available. So we've, I think, come to understand that much of it has been either ignored, erased, or just distorted in one way or another. And there's my acronym that I use, hold everything. No history, of course, is ever complete. I could stand up here for 3 days and still not even touch the surface. But knowing the diverseness of this city and the tapestry of it and San Antonio's origins is ever more important. And looking at the input of the black community into San Antonio's contributions is very important as well. We have not talked about or really not understood that in order to understand this past history, we have to know when blacks first came here. And just around the corner from here, we know that a black Moor by the name of Stephen the Black, or Esteban in Spanish, actually visited the area around the 1500s, 1530 or so. And we also know that there were trade routes between San Antonio and Mexico. Now, looking at the demographic makeup of Mexico, we know that there were hundreds, of thousands of slaves brought into Mexico, a lot of them from Angola and from the surrounding areas, and some from other parts as well. But Angola kind of stands out for a number of reasons in terms of numbers, in terms of opposition to slavery by the Angolans and so forth. There's actually a documentation by Father Morphy, who documented a lot of his travels throughout the United States of black input into the area. And he actually talks about a number of blacks that were at San Saba Mission. He gives numbers. I think that number was about 140 at one time. Of course, San Saba is just, I believe, a few miles to the northwest of San Antonio. Now, in understanding all of that, Veracruz was a port city in which large numbers of black slaves were imported into the area. And so the trade route that did exist and documented in primary source material was between Veracruz, by the way, Santa Anna's home city, a lot of black slaves in that area. And the trade route, and when we talk about trade route in those days, we're talking about mule-drawn carriages and wagons and so forth, where they would bring in goods and supply the missions and so forth. Now, all of this is a result, obviously, of something that happened for over 700 years, and that's the Moorish domination of Spain. I always get a kick out of telling people that who think they have a Hispanic last name in origin. It sometimes is not. Medina, obviously, is a holy city in Saudi Arabia. Medina is not a Hispanic name, it's Arabic. Alcocer is another one because the first two letters, Al and CER, have a relationship to the Moorish influence. Alvarez has a relationship to the Moorish influence. Matter of fact, you get the double whammy there, Al and EZ at the end. So a lot of names that have ordinarily been passed off as Hispanic are obviously not in origin, not Hispanic at all. So we have this result of a black presence on the Iberian Peninsula that was erased. And let me tell you, during the Spanish Inquisition, they did a good job of it. They would vet people. And the vetting would consist of sometimes hours. If you wanted to hold a secular position in society or a religious position, say in the priesthood in society, you would be vetted. Who's your mother? Where was she born? Who was your father? Where was he born? Where were your grandparents born? In what parish? In what area? And what they were trying to do is see if you had any, quote, black blood or Jewish blood in your body. And if you did, you could be excluded from occupying certain positions, both religious and secular. So that's very important in understanding that, and also understanding the results of how that was carried over into the New World. For a period of time, if any of your ancestry, and the word sometimes used was polluted, quote unquote, or contaminated by black or Jewish blood, then you were not even allowed to come into what was referred to as the New World. So that's another issue that took place. And many social scientists trace the origins of eugenics, at least what I might call proto-eugenics, to the Spanish, because they were doing that way before Adolf Hitler. So this is something we need to be mindful of. At one time, and I get a kick out of this, because people question these numbers because it's sometimes just hard to believe in today's world. But according to Dr. Tucker in his this last year's book he did on America's first war for slavery, in 1830, Mexico possessed more than 600,000 mulattoes, people of Spanish and African blood, among its population. And then we have some evidence, primary source documentation from Dr. Henry Louis Gates, that during the Atlantic slave trade, some 550,000 black slaves were transported into Mexico. So, and there's some good pictures. As a matter of fact, that lady there with the longer afro looks a little bit like my grandmother, right? Because she was Afro-Mexican. So that's kind of close, maybe a little bit more like the other one. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, so that's something very important to remember. Now, once you become absorbed into the Spanish system of racial delineation, then you might become a casta, meaning a caste. You belong to a certain caste based on skin color. Of course, ancient slavery and modern day slavery based on skin color, you've got to understand the difference. They're totally different from one another. So when someone says, well, the Egyptians have slavery, so what are you guys all mad about? Well, that's not the same as slavery based on skin color. And certainly had instances of proto-racism in the past, but not institutionalized. That doesn't happen until the advent of slavery in the 1500s, 1600s, and so forth. I mentioned the Moorish influence. The domed roof, obviously, is an example of that. Well, you can go to the west side of San Antonio and see Catholic churches with a domed roof. And one way in architectural design to show that you have kind of conquered the other people is you put a cross on the top, a bell tower, or something else, so that you kind of erase the meaning of the domed roof. So this is what the Spaniards do throughout this part of the world, and then on the Iberian Peninsula as well. I mentioned also that, and I'm doing some primary source documentation on this as well, because I seem to be two different sources. There was no north and south of San Antonio back in the 1600s, 1700s. There was only east and west of the river. So according to some of the documents that I've seen, and I'm looking, I got to go to Austin and look up some other ones, but because I teach at UTSA, and we don't have, there's a volume or two missing from Father Morphy's diary. But I'm looking for maybe the Spanish decree that allowed the Canary Islanders to separate blacks from whites. The western side of the river was set aside, at least according to several theses, PhD thesis papers I've seen, and then the documentation, and I have to follow that documentation, but it looks very much like that the western side of the river was set up for, quote, for the whites, whatever that means, and Spain having been conquered by the Moors for 700 years, I have a lot of problems with saying Spaniards were white. But anyway, or even recognizing race as something real in the first place. But, and then the eastern side of the river set aside for darker skinned Afro-Mestizos, Afro-Indios, Christianized Moors, and according to some of the research that I've seen, Canary Islanders came in two different sets, Christianized Spaniards and Christianized Moors. And so the eastern side of San Antonio River, you could make the argument that that was the first line of segregation in the city of San Antonio. There's just some photo there of black Moors who came with Cortez. I think Henry Louis Gates documents that in his book, Life Upon These Shores, where when they conquered the Aztecs, and this is not, I'm not saying this as something that black people ought to be proud of, because black conquistadors who are absorbed in the Spanish system, the Costa system, go to defeat the Aztecs when Cortez invades Mexico. But nevertheless, that's erased from history. Mexico, is safe to say, by 1600s, there were already black slaves and freemen that worked as artisans and traders that would have traveled to San Antonio well before the 1700s and the Canary Islander input. Veracruz black populations may have large numbers of Angolan slaves and freemen, as I said, and that was a trade route. In the center of the city of Veracruz, there's a statue of Yanga, Asper Yanga, Angolan fighter against Spanish slavery, and they celebrate him in Mexico all the time. This is something that is very interesting. Well, I had a friend of mine who did research. He was going, I think he was going to the University of Chicago. He had an uncle or a relative, close relative, and he informed him, I'm going to Mexico to do research, and his relative, older relative, said, what are you going to do research on? And his response was, well, I'm going to go research blacks in Mexico. And the response he got from his, I think it was his grandfather or uncle, said, oh, come on, man, you're going to have a hard time proving that. There aren't any blacks in Mexico. And then that was his exact response. Well, he came back with all these beautiful pictures, Costa paintings, and everything else, actually pictures of some of Pancho Villa's Afro-Mexican fighters. And so his, unfortunately, his grandfather or uncle, whoever it was, had to eat those words. So that's something that's often been erased. The erasure of black presence where it could have been done was done on purpose. And so we see some of that taking place, not just in Mexico, but here as well. Eugenics, I mentioned that before, probably had its beginnings in Spain when people were vetted. I mentioned that. Oh, by the way, there's a great book there if you haven't read it. It's called Genealogical Fictions. Sometimes people would pay a judge or someone of importance a certain amount of money to change their birth certificate to where it might have said mulatto, for example, to change it to white. And if you have the right money and the right social position, you might be able to do that. So a little bit different from people passing for white in this country, but I think you understand the point if you understand the history of that here. So this racial fictions obviously is done in New Spain, which is Mexico. And the theory of the purity of blood was obviously linked to these false conceptions of race. Now, later on, all that becomes scientific racism under Blumenbach and Linnaeus. You know, the sad thing about scientists, and I love science, it's one of my favorite hobbies. I have an engineering degree, by the way, which I never use. But one of the sad things about scientists and historians, too, if they have a hero in their particular field, they don't want to admit that hero's shortcomings. So when I mention Blumenbach and I mention Carl Linnaeus, the fathers of scientific racism, oh, you should see the jumping up and down. You know, well, he created the greatest taxonomy of plants and now, yeah. Well, he ruined the world on top of it. The fathers of scientific racism. So when you try to hide these kinds of things, that becomes a problem. Because sooner or later in the 21st century, we've got all this technology, we're going to find out about it. So these are racial fictions obviously created in more than one way and across the globe. I mentioned that, the idea of black blood. The Spanish conquistadors actually had a thing that they used to do called the back of the hand test. And I think everybody knows that because light goes onto the skin, it's reflected like a prism. So you look at your hand, if you're light, the veins might look blood. And I think everybody in the world was told, your blood is blue, and when it hits the oxygen, it turns red. Well, we all know that's false. Totally false. But they had this back of the hand test, sangre azul in Spanish, meaning what? I'm blue-blooded, and if you're blue-blooded, then you're white. And sometimes you would see drawings of conquistadors where they would hold their hand up like that to reveal the back of the hand. I'm white, meaning that your blood is not contaminated with the blood of the Moors. Now, I'm not asking anybody to look at the back of their hand, but you might be mindful of that. So that was considered a blemish for many, many years. And of course, in the 1700s, Blumenbach and Linnaeus make racism scientific. And of course, it's been undone completely now. All kinds of discrimination. Of course, many of you have seen some of these Costa paintings where they do portray in paintings a lighter skinned person, maybe a Spaniard, a darker skinned person, maybe an African, and then on the top they tell you what's produced from that relationship and they give it a name. And often the names are zoological names, like mulatto means what? Mule, small mule, little mule. And oftentimes these names are chosen because mules tend to have big lips. Now you make the comparison, and that's why they pick mulatto. So mulatto is not a name you ought to be proud of, in case anybody in here is, because it wasn't created to that. It was created in a very racist manner. So this is a way that all this kind of stuff takes place. Ancestry erased and Hispanicized after the Moors are defeated. Concerted effort to deny all Moorish and Jewish ancestry. Islamic books and mosques are burned. That can only be described as ethnocide. And then your Spanish names, as I mentioned before. And then, of course, many pretend that blacks never existed in Mexico, and that's still common. You still hear that being commonly said all of the time. So that's always been a problem. There are all these names that denote blackness, right? Negrete, if your last name is Negrete, I guarantee you that's a Casta name. If your last name is Mora, that's a Casta name. I guarantee you got a black relative. Moreno is another one. There's a bunch of them. And these are all Casta names. So on any slave auction block where they might, or even in not necessarily a block, but slave sales, where a person is being sold, and they were commonly known as Juan. Let's just say Juan's being sold for 50 pesos. Well, because his skin color would be that of a Moreno, then Juan Moreno becomes his name. And so this is how those names are attached to people. He actually had two birth certificate books in the Spanish Casta system, one called Libros, or Book of the Castas, people of mixed race, and then the Libros of the Españoles, or books of the Spanish whites. And they would keep these birth certificate books in the church. So that people could find out if you were, quote, contaminated with the blood of the Africans or the Moors. Many of these river residents in San Antonio were obviously darker Moorish islanders, Native Americans, mixed race Afro-Mexicans or Castas. San Antonio River, obviously the borderline between segregation during this period. And then things do change as the railroad comes into town, and then we have people, Anglos generally escaping, according to Dr. Miller, Char Miller, and I think that's correct, that Anglos left the inner city and headed north when the railroad came, and you get these railroad lines being established because now we've got a north-south line of segregation that's established over time. So you got these narratives that are lost and are left on the edges of history, and a lot of this stuff has just totally been erased, like I said. So you got missions holding native slaves and Native Americans as well. And all of them, all of the missions were built with Indian slave labor and in some cases black labor. That's also been erased. So we've got these issues, and you know, none of us ever talk or get to talk about the mayors of San Antonio who owned slave auction blocks. Charles King was one of them. Francois Giroux was another one. Giroux was another one. Anybody ever been to Club Giroux in the river? Well, you might think about that next time you go there. I don't get a pleasant feeling when I go there anymore. But that's an issue that came up. Carolyn, another mayor of San Antonio, I think he got killed in the Civil War. He was also a slave on a slave auction block, sold slaves here in San Antonio. And I've been able to determine a few of the places where they sold slaves. On the Salado Creek was one place they were being sold, as well as the back steps of the courthouse. Spanish sold slaves around the governor's palace across the street. And the Minger Hotel actually served as a place to sell slaves in private showings. And they would advertise those private showings in the local newspapers. And you can look that up under the microfiche of newspapers from that time. The Herald carries a lot of that. San Antonio Herald carries a lot of that information. So we had that kind of stuff happening as well. And then I just gave you an example of that, a bill of sale between Maria Josefa Flores de Valdez and Justo Boneo y Morales for a Negro slave named Luis Villa of San Fernando and Presidio of the Bear. Bill between Gil Ibarro and Angel Navarro. Angel Navarro, ooh. And when you look at, by the way, when you look at Juan Seguin and Jose Antonio Navarro, I don't have too much good to say about them. They were pro-slavery men, and it makes very much sense of why they supported the people at the Alamo. They believed in slavery too. And by the way, Sam Houston commissioned Juan Seguin to chase slaves who had been freed by Santa Anna. Everywhere Santa Anna went, and I'm not saying he was the best guy on earth, but everywhere he went, he freed slaves. Everywhere he went, he freed slaves. And they either joined the Mexican army or they went across the border to freedom. Houston commissioned Juan Seguin to go and chase them down. He wasn't fortunate enough to get very many of them back because the Mexican army, even in defeat, refused to do that. So that's another story that has been HOLD erased. Okay. I mentioned that. We kind of did that. Of course, all this, the war with Mexico is a result of a lot of different things, but one primary and central thing is a result of Vicente Guerrero's abolishment of slavery in 1829. And that's well documented. And of course, you can look at newspaper clips from that era, and Anglo settlers just went mad when they found out that slavery was being abolished. They went bananas. So this is something ignored. And I always wondered why they were so concerned about fighting under the 1824 Constitution. Well, that was the Constitution that allowed slavery. And let me tell you, Santa Anna was the godfather of his oldest girl was Vicente Guerrero. And it makes sense that Santa Anna would be very much in support of the abolishment of slavery. I mean, he has a direct relationship with blacks, okay? Of course, that's never said. JC6 should also be a black celebration. And why? Because Guerrero abolished slavery during the period of the celebrations of JC6. And there's some modern day pictures of Afro-Mexicans around the cities of Veracruz, Acapulco in the west, a little town called Costa Chica. I think that middle one is from Costa Chica. And many of the dances that we normally associate with being Mexican are actually African and Angolan. La Bamba is Angolan, not Mexican at all. And so these are examples of that. A large number of the black population, mulatto army, along with Mexican soldiers, were forced to surrender on September 11th, 1829. Santa Anna saved Guerrero's presidency that would eventually allow Guerrero to abolish slavery a few days later and during JC6. Unknown to many, was also a celebration long forgotten. So I encourage my family, who is African American, to go out and celebrate JC6 and make sure you tell everybody it's a black celebration too. Of course, Guerrero was executed, and had a lot to do with him being black, and there were always comments being made about him being black by the people in power at that particular time. There's a drawing of a black soldier that would have been around since colonial times. Black soldiers were around since that time. And by the way, Simon Bolivar, who was fighting for freedom against the Spaniards in Venezuela and other places in South America, actually made some arrangements with Haitian revolutionaries who had obviously been freed in the revolt against the French, from Toussaint-Louverture and later on Pétion, and others who actually were supportive of the war against Spain in Texas. And at Galveston, around 1814, 1816, 200 Haitian troops landed at the island of, on the Isle of Galveston to help the rebels fight against Spain just before the 1821 battle. Was there any history of the Haitians coming here to help us? They've all been erased. The Battle of San Jacinto was a horrible day for black people in Texas. Why? With the defeat of Mexico and Santa Anna, black slaves were to be returned to their owners. During that time of the Battle of the Alamo, Mexico had abolished slavery, and everywhere Santa Anna went, as I said, he freed slaves, much to the hatred of Houston, Crockett, Bowie, Antonio Navarro, and Juan Seguin. Sam Houston had plotted with Andrew Jackson. That's another unknown piece. Andrew Jackson considered Sam Houston like a stepson. They were very close, and we all know from history Andrew Jackson's total deal was manifest destiny. He wanted to remove all Native Americans, replace them with slaves, and continue the march on the westward expansion of the United States. And the degree to which Jackson and Sam Houston had a relationship is yet to be fully explored. But there is a ton of letters between the two and a ton of communication between the two, how they sought very, very early on to rip Texas away from Mexico. So this presents itself in a book called by Dr. Philip Tucker, called America's First Forgotten War for Slavery, the Battle of the Alamo. Okay? So we see that that's something that is an issue. I mentioned that the black Haitians in Texas, slaves obviously brought to, the ex-mayor's wife, Julian Castro, his wife Rosie Castro, said that Bowie was nothing but a drunk. There's actually a letter from Travis to the president of Texas, Smith, saying, asking that Bowie be removed from the Alamo because he won't obey anybody. He's always drunk. He's always acting up. He's totally unruly, and obviously before he could be removed, the Alamo fell. But I think Rosie Castro deserves an apology because even according to Travis, he was a drunk. Of course, slavery is reinstated after Mexico is defeated, and blacks were a population subject to harsh plantation and farm life along the banks of the San Antonio River, local creeks, as pro-slavery Southerners flooded into the state, many of them from Louisiana, from militia fighters from Kentucky, and these are all pro-slavery men. They flooded in here like you wouldn't believe. And because this was the place where you could bring slaves, where you could sell slaves, where you could use slaves to harvest cotton and then become wealthy overnight. So slave farms dotted the landscape in San Antonio, right, and especially in the northern sector, some in the southern sector, but as I said, along creeks and so forth. We know that in the Applewhite area, Mitchell Lake areas, on the near south side, there's actually slave cemeteries there, been buried for a long time. Over here on the north side, as researcher Everett Fly discovered that there are several African American slave cemeteries near Thousand Oaks and Nacogdoches, and then outside 1604 as well. All been covered over like they don't exist in an attempt to hide the relationship that San Antonio had with slavery. A very purposeful attempt to hide this stuff. And there's your black cemeteries. Of course, some of that stuff you can find from Randolph Campbell's book, An Empire for Slavery, a very good book. If you want to do some genealogy, that's a good place to start. Obviously, a courthouse is a good place to start, and that's very obvious in his book. But he also noted Bexar County recorded around 1,100 slaves by 1864 in the local area, a fairly large number given the small population that San Antonio had at that particular time. And there's your mayors and political figures who owned slaves. By the way, Samuel Maverick was a member of, at one point, Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a pre-Ku Klux Klan type group that existed here in San Antonio. So those are all these things that are hidden. You've got a Reconstruction in San Antonio took place. I had black police officers here during the Reconstruction period, appointed by Governor Davis, who was a radical Republican. We don't talk about that too much. That needs to be researched and more work done on that. And I did all that on St. Paul Square. I mentioned that. That's still there. I was able to do a historical marker in front of their church, which you can go read for yourself now. Not a church anymore. It's a place where people rent the building for weddings and so forth. But it still has all of their original markings of the church. Of course, the church I belong to, Mount Zion First Baptist Church, was part of the original black settlement over where the Victoria Courts, now called Victoria Commons, used to be. There's also another historical marker that I authored in that area on Santos Street. And I'll mention this in closing, because my time's running out, right? Gosh, just when I was getting warmed up. Reverend Claude Black obviously was a very strong civil rights leader in San Antonio. He was a city councilman, one of the premier civil rights leaders in this part of the world. And he did a very good job of bringing all kinds of fights to City Hall in fighting Mayor Walter McAllister. And that, of course, McAllister, an admitted segregationist, and that's why a lot of that happened. I have a bunch of other stuff. I can't run through all this. This is only a 25-minute class. You have to come to my class to get the whole 9 yards. So that I'm going to kind of end it there, and thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so honored to be here in this distinguished conference with professors that I've read their books and professors that I've had in college throughout the years that are here. And wonderful to be here on this panel with Dr. Latimore and Mario Salas, with whom I got the honor and privilege to meet by serving on the Bexar County Historical Commission, of which I just started last August. And for me, it is also about filling in the gaps. An influential work of Alwyn Barr's Blacks in Texas. You hear the story about Esteban, and you see that story about Esteban, and you saw that here, and you see Sam Houston. And so I was also very interested between Esteban and Joshua Houston, who was a slave of Sam Houston. And so that led me to doing a publication called Between Esteban and Joshua Houston, Women, Children, and Slavery in the Texas borderlands. And essentially, that became a publication in the Journal of South Texas History 2014. And interestingly, that there were about 32 slave sales that had occurred beginning in 1743 all the way up until around 1820, and involving some of the elites of San Antonio, the Tejano elites, including Jose Antano Navarro's father, Angel Navarro, and of course Gilibarbo, but a lot of other people that we would identify as Canary Islanders, and then later on, I mean, Jim Bowie, who married into the Veramendi family, Ursula Veramendi, showing some cross-cultural ties there in converting to Catholicism. And so I diverged from that focus upon slavery by looking at a Spanish fort called Los Adayes, which is out of sight, out of mind. And it was the first capital of Texas under Spain. It was established under the Aguayo expedition in 1721, designated the capital of Texas 1729. The archaeological site is in northwestern Louisiana. And so I looked at that region in East Texas from this border perspective of both sides of the border, the Spanish and the French, just as in the present day, for example, my wife being from Laredo, Texas, and right now she's actually across the border in Nuevo Laredo, that you have these cross-border towns perspectives along these multiple borderlands that exist across not only in Texas, but indeed across the Western Hemisphere. And what happened then was that as I completed that manuscript, I was very interested in the fact that when those soldiers were, those soldiers and their families, the residents of Los Arayas, were ordered to move to San Antonio in 1773 because the King of Spain, Carlos III, had ordered the fort abandoned. They're basically moving the frontier backward, pulling back to San Antonio. Half of those settlers returned to East Texas under Gilibarbo, and then about less than half end up here in San Antonio, and they settle on the some of the lands, the secularized lands of Mission San Antonio de Valero. But what's fascinating is that it was until getting done with that research that I wanted to look into the sacramental records for San Antonio, not just census records. And I ended up coming across a couple of documents. One is 1785, which is listed in that program from the sacramental records. This one, 1810, and this one from a series called Blacks in Texas. And you have census records that come from the Bear Archives. But in this one here, we can see that there is a guy by the name of Pedro Ramirez. That's a good African name, isn't it? But he's negro libre. He's a free black. And nacido de, or natural de, meaning that, you are originally from or you were born in, and in this case, Guinea. And I'm Hispanicizing it, but it's Guinea, as in West Africa. And there's Upper Guinea and Lower Guinea. And he was 58 years old, estado viudo, meaning that you have, as Dr. Porter is talking about, women who became widows. You have widowers. And among his property, he has 2 caballos, just 2 horses. And what's interesting is that in his particular case, he is on a ranch, and I have the translation here. Sorry, I should have put that one first. But he's on a ranch under el sindicado Don Joaquin Leal, and that Leal goes back to the Canary Islanders. And a syndic is somebody who is basically a Spanish official charged with organizing cattle ranching in San Antonio. And there's about 5 to 7 of these guys, most of them having ties back to the Canary Islanders. And this is on the Santa Rita de las Islas ranch where he is listed. And as I mentioned, Don Joaquin Leal having these roots with the Canary Islanders, even the surname of his wife, Arocha. And we end up seeing Pedro Ramirez actually appear much earlier in a church record for marriage petitions. And this comes from the San Fernando church records. But at the time, I was researching Los Arayas, and I came across this, and I said, I gotta Xerox that and put that aside and come back to it later. And that was, God, it seemed like such a long time ago because that's when the DRT archives were still at the Alamo. And there it states that Pedro Ramirez, but it mentions he's a negro from Guyana. And Guyana, you can confuse that for Guyana as in South America, on the borderlands of both Venezuela and Brazil. And that was the English translation. And it wasn't until I saw that 1810 one that I said, no, it's actually Guinea, which is West Africa. So there's a caution there about the translations. But what's also fascinating in this case is the fact that you have him showing here, he's been living in the Villa de San Fernando for 8 years. He's married. He wants to marry Rosalia, who's a slave from the Villa de Coahuila, presumably Saltillo. They don't say Saltillo, and they don't state her casta designation. And when I first presented part of this research, when I first started, at a symposium at Texas State University with De La Teja sitting in there and Joaquin Revalla Martinez. And I was like, why did they make that omission when they record everybody's casta? And I said, I just kind of raised the suggestion that maybe, like when you launder money, that maybe you can launder people. And that one way of filtering people into captivity and selling them into slave markets, for example, in Louisiana, or sending them further south through Veracruz, like you did with Apaches, and historians talk about Apaches being captured and sent, end up in New Orleans, end up in Havana, Cuba. But there's no smoking gun. However, you do see in the slave sales that I mentioned earlier, inventions of the casta designations that aren't on a chart, like de color quebrado, broken color. And basically that's just referring to somebody of mixed background. They couldn't really decide, was it Morisco, was it Moren, what was it? But nonetheless, it mentions also that you have that they've known each other for 8 years. Rosalia's 20 years old. She didn't sign the declaration. You had a notary public, which was important if you did not have, for lack of papel común and having the stamp, you'd have testigos or witnesses on there. And Pedro says the same thing, and that he was 32 at the time, so he's 12 years older than Rosalia. And so then you have other witnesses, in this case, Julián de Arrocha, from the Arrocha family, stating that he's known both of them, said that he himself is 44, and he signed the book. And feast days held, Father Fuentes signed the book, but this is what's blew my mind, is that it says, Father Fuentes certified that Pedro Ramirez, alias Mandingo, a free negro, and Rosalia, a slave, were married on May 30th, 1785. And Mandingo just, boom, it's like just open up a whole lot of things that in terms of the African diaspora that really blew my mind. So who was Pedro Ramirez? He's not Esteban. He's not Joshua Houston. He's not Juan Guerrido. Maybe he could be of some other kind of folkloric hero. But he's obviously not a Canary Islander or Presidio soldier, not a missionary or mission Indians. But in other words, he's not part of the narrative when we think about San Antonio normally and its history. How did he end up here? Was he always free or enslaved and then freed? There's examples that I saw at Los Adayas in the 1750s and 1760s in which you had slaves fleeing French masters arriving at the Spanish missions of East Texas seeking sanctuary. The priests would have been like, well, gosh, for the fact that the Caddos did not want to congregate in the missions of East Texas, we'll take anybody coming in. And so the Spanish had to decide, do we return this individual back to their masters in Louisiana? So you do have instances of this fugitive slaves occurring. And of course, it increases a lot more getting closer to an event that we all learn in U.S. history, and that is the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, where you have many more fugitive slaves coming from Louisiana, as well as U.S. Army deserters. And what's interesting in that case is that you end up having in Nacogdoches, Texas, for example, a lot more people who end up showing up on the census, 1809, who are from Guinea. They're from Guinea. And many, many more that keep coming. But just to move on, we have this story of runaway slaves, like Mario mentioned, in terms of Yanga. And in Mexico, just to give you a visual there, you have Veracruz down there in the bottom. So you have possibly coming from Africa to Cuba or to Hispaniola, from there to Veracruz, which was essentially became a slave society. But from there going to Mexico City and then making their way up the Camino Real. And there is a slave sale of 1748 in which a couple of individuals who are described as negros esclavos were sold to the governor of Texas at the time. And the individual doing the sale was actually a resident from Mexico City. And so in essence, it's quite possible they came up from Mexico City with their previous owner. And we have also the Camino Real that I mentioned to you, so that you have Spanish settlement moving northward from Mexico City in search of the silver, if you will, and a central corridor, the first one that goes to Santa Fe, the northeastern one that eventually makes its way all the way and sneaks into what is present-day northwestern Louisiana. And so that it's possible that you have several directions in which Pedro Ramirez came to San Antonio. Who was Rosalia? Was she a slave in Saltillo before coming to San Antonio? When did she and Pedro Ramirez meet? Where? How? Why was her cast not recorded? But what's interesting is that I don't see her again in the record like I did Pedro Ramirez later on. And so there is that Sistema de Castas, a genre of paintings that emerged in the 18th century in colonial Mexico. And interestingly enough, many of those artists were described as mulattoes themselves. And any number of combinations. Mario Salas mentioned the book by Maria Martinez, The Genealogical Fictions. This is a great book because it's a foot in Spain and a foot in Mexico. And I would definitely recommend that in terms of learning about this mestizaje or mixing. But what's fascinating is the fact that you end up having, like he said, in terms of erasure, that is no joke. Historian Sarah O'Toole talks about Africans in colonial Peru in the 18th century and basically talking about how for people there, the Spanish government, you're either going to be Spanish or you're going to be Indian. You may not be there yet, but eventually you will. Because from the very beginning, the Spanish colonization was the design of the República de Indios and the República de Españoles, the Republic of Indians and the Republic of Spaniards, so that they were segregated from the very beginning. Africans were to end up in that República de Españoles. And so that in the 18th century, with the increasing mixtures of peoples, and Mario Salas mentioned the immigration, and it's amazing how Mexico is overlooked in terms of the slave trade. And I've heard figures, Mario Salas quoted 500,000, so that anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000 Colin Powler, slaves of white God, talking about slavery in Mexico, talks about these numbers as well. But we'll move on. And that is multicultural mix of these slaves and servants. Baptism of daughter, whose father, Pedro Morales, mulatto, he's a singer at the church. And his mother, Maria del Loreto Castellón Coyota, from Mission Concepcion. You have baptism of a daughter whose mother, Antonio Rodriguez, is Comanche Indian and is a maid in the home of Doña Polonia Curbelo. And so that when you see Don or Doña, it signifies an honorific, a title of nobility. A baptism of Maria Nazaria Perez, a mulatta slave. Mulatta slave. They have to make sure they mention esclava, not mulata libre, but mulata esclava. 5 days old, natural child of Maria Perez, father unknown, godparents Antonio Perez and Maria Ignacia Romero, which brings up the issues of illegitimacy. Baptism of Jose Tomás Esteban Candelario. This one's really good. 1808, an American Negro. And I don't even feel comfortable saying that in English. I always say negro because my parents who come from Cuba, it's like very natural for me to say negro in vez de decir negro. But we know that the adaptation to that word that occurs from the English in the English coming from that Spanish. And interestingly enough, acquired by Don Clemente Delgado. And so you have Delgado, another name that has these ties to Canary Islanders. and these people that are the mayors of San Antonio, many of them. And what's interesting then is this mix of peoples who come and go, many of them that are servants, whether they're free or slave. And you can imagine yourself then in being downtown San Antonio, in which these people who are a servant class are going from their own homes, crossing the street, if you will, or the plaza to go serve in the home of somebody else if they did not actually live there. And so I want to move forward. To just come to this and this on the ranch, it wasn't just Pedro Ramirez, but you also had under the other individuals. And in this case, Felix Estrada, Boca de Leones. What you end up seeing is people coming from different parts of Mexico, coming from Cuba, coming from Spain, coming from the United States, coming from Canada. It's amazing how you do end up with this mix of peoples. And we're talking even before Stephen F. Austin arrived. You have the family of Doña Josefa Rodriguez, his wife, native of this capital, a son, and servants, Ciriaco Gonzalez, overseer, native of Chihuahua, Rafael Gonzalez, described as a cowboy, a vaquero. And you have the agrites, or the agringados. Those are the political in-laws, if you will. And Doña Luisa Guerrero, his mother-in-law, native of this capital, San Antonio, 80 years old. She's a widow of Don Salvador Rodriguez. She fits in with Dr. Porter's work about women. And it's amazing how you just end up keep finding more and more of these widows with this property. And I don't know about you, but 60 cows sounds like quite a bit to me. I mean, even if you consider that maybe 300 acres will work for 30 cows, I mean, that's pretty significant. But her servants, Luis Hernandez, a cowboy. And then there's Manuela Perez, esclava, 90 years old. Just like Rosalia, her designation is not given. Well, 90, and do the math, 10 years older than Luisa Guerrero. I don't know, was she with the family for many, many years? Quite possibly. But trying to get here closer to the end then, you have these burials of Pedro Morales, mulatto, free adult slave, served for over 20 years in this church. He's the one that was the singer, buried free. He was killed by Indians. And then just the post-Republic period that you continue to see some of these names. This was, I just had to point out, burial of Miguel in 1844, 100 years old. A slave of John McMullen, and was a widower, wife's name unknown. And then just to show that you have numbers of Anglos, German, French, who are coming in, and they too appear in these sacramental records. And not all of them that are slave owners, but you do have some that own slaves. And then the fact that you have the missions themselves, the Barrio de Valero district, which I was highly keen on, because Adeseños end up there. And when you look at the census records for the missions, you end up seeing negro, mulatto, mulatto. And I'm like, oh my God, this is incredible. And Barrio del Sur, so the south side of San Antonio, if you will. Talking about neighborhoods like Mario was mentioning. And so what does the story tell us about San Antonio, late 18th to 19th century? And just any number of conclusions that historiographically I was taking issue with Alicia Shark's very well-known article, Demographic Analysis of Texas, which looks at the census records and tends to denigrate, or at least to undercount, not necessarily undercount, but to say that the black presence wasn't significant. And so this kind of comes back to revisit, because she's looking at census records, but when you're looking at Sacramento records and you start realizing, gosh, there's these greater numbers. And then it begs to also ask the question in terms of people who did pass for Spanish or who may have become Indian. Were they mulatto at one point? And so that you have this precariousness of race, and the fact that if you were mulatto, you did not want to stay mulatto because then you could become enslaved. And so preference to go to either pure Spanish or to pure Indian. And you have this presence of these different casta names that appear there that challenge the notion of greater freedom on the frontier, which you see ubiquitously in the historiography. But it also calls to mind not just slavery, but servitude. So those that are both slave and free, and the fact that you have Comanches next door to someone who is mulatto, or someone like Pedro Ramirez who is next door to somebody who's Apache, because you see many Apache names that appear on there. And this, long before Stephen F. Austin came to San Antonio, you had the presence of free blacks and mulattoes, and this intimacy that occurs here in San Antonio, and the fact then that to end, Pedro Ramirez and many more people with San Antonio slave and free became invisible in the story of the struggles over Texas. And you can go on to talk about the Texas Revolution. But what's fascinating, too, is the fact that the casta designations, I started to notice that by 1824, that is several years after Mexican independence, during the first Republic of Texas, you start seeing those casta designations drop off. So that in Mexico, it is, todos somos mexicanos. We are all Mexican, trying to get everybody to buy into the nation. But we also know that still half the population of Mexico was Indian. And they're Indian first and Mexican second, many of them to this day. But you do have the remains of these class distinctions. And so then to try to realize that when you have this greater immigration coming from the United States of immigrants who may be German, maybe Irish, maybe French, or what have you, that are also bringing in slaves, many of them coming from Virginia or Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina, that they're mixing in, blending in with this previous population, that it is understandable to understand this kind of erasure that would occur, especially on the northern frontier. But in essence, you might also put up there that, from what I see, San Antonio being an extension of a place like Saltillo, where when I first started looking at slavery, I told a friend of mine from Saltillo that I was investigating the slavery of blacks in Mexico, when I mentioned Saltillo and Monterrey, he goes, no, aquí no hay. No, there's none here. Pero mira, allí en Veracruz sí hay. In Veracruz, there's African slavery. So it was to just kind of suggest that you wouldn't find that here. And so I kind of took that here to San Antonio, and believing that, there really wasn't much. But then once you start looking into the records, you realize that there's more stories that are to be told. I think that's the last one. Thank you.
Time for one or two questions.
Very good program. As to the part about being erased, there is an enormous amount that's erased. And one of the things that's erased is we celebrate Juneteenth here in Texas, but I came across an actual written proclamation of emancipation Santa Anna wrote March the 16th, 1836, here in San Antonio. And the copy of it survived in Connecticut, of all places. But it is a written out Emancipation Proclamation 30-something years before Abraham Lincoln did and before Juneteenth. And the other thing is the first soldier killed in San Antonio or in Texas was a soldier named Juan Blanco. He's buried at Mission Valero, and it said he was killed by the Apaches near the mission, and I think it's 1730s or 1740s. So he's one of the first named Negroes in Texas. Another thing is during the Civil War, there's mentioned by a survivor who was interviewed from the Civil War, and they asked him about the Alamo, and he said there was a slave market on the steps, what's called the Long Barracks, but he says that there on the upstairs steps that's where a slave market was during the Civil War, and he lists the prices of males and female slaves. So there's a whole bunch of hot potato stuff going on here with the emancipation of slaves.
For anyone interested in the Black community in San Antonio, the archives at UTSA has the entire newspaper, Black newspaper, and that can be found at the UTSA archives. And that would give you an insight into the San Antonio Black community during modern times.
Dr. Galan, as far as culture, it seems to me that when you have different groups, there are cross contributions, you might say, in the various norms that they have. Can you tell us anything about the contribution of Black norms into the general cultural life of San Antonio?
That's what you can find in the newspapers.
Well, I'll just project my voice. What I didn't mention was the fact that there is some work, John Thornton, who wrote Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, 1400 to 1680. And he talks about how from the very beginning of Spanish conquest in Hispaniola, that you find the need for Africans to work on the estates. And you have vaqueros and ganaderos, cowboys, on these in the mid-16th century, who specifically citing Wolof, Fula, and Mandinga, that these were areas where they had a strong equestrian and cattle-raising tradition. In other words, in West Africa, that you have Africans who know something about cattle. And Andrew Schluter, who wrote a book fairly recent, published with Yale University Press, called Black Ranching Frontiers, that talks about these different regions. And he also includes Mexico, Louisiana, South America, and in the Caribbean. So that perhaps you have then some influence in the fact that when you think about in terms of African American history, those who became, for example, Black cowboys of Texas, that you have this kind of background that is not just as we think in terms of African Americans and Black cowboys of Texas, but the fact that it's all over Latin America. And the fact that when you have people moving into Veracruz, the Huasteca region north of Veracruz, the Spanish didn't want the Africans to basically run away and join up with Indians in rebellion, because that's what happened in the Caribbean from the very beginning. So I would really be interested in this of them being on the ranches, because some that appear on the properties. The fact that in South San Antonio you have in southern Bexar County, when you mentioned the Applewhite slaves, in other words, a borderlands of ranching economies overlapping with plantation economies. And that is something that you see, for example, the western end of Hispaniola with Haiti and the eastern end of Santo Domingo, where you have the eastern end that is under the Spanish, basically cattle ranching, feeding the populations on the western end of the island that are working the sugar plantations. And you see that with Louisiana and the development of tobacco and then later sugar, that you have this kind of westward movement of these peoples, immigrants, and but there is other influence there that just begs further questions. For example, the singer in the church as well, and the fact that you have skilled jobs like blacksmiths and others that would appear in the missions, because the missions are declining in numbers in the 1770s. Send some of those Alaseños in there, and among those soldiers from East Texas, they're also identified as mulattoes as well, and so that still requires more investigation. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I forgot to mention that earlier. Okay.